Look, I need to tell someone about this absolute nightmare my life has become, and honestly, I don't even know where to start. I'm Ella. I'm 44, and apparently my past just came back to bite me in the most twisted way possible. So you know how they say what goes around comes around? Well, that's complete garbage because I've been dealing with the consequences of one mistake for over 2 decades, and now it's gotten so much worse. 24 years ago, I was engaged to this guy Connor, and yeah, I cheated on him. But here's what nobody wants to hear. Sometimes life isn't black and white, and sometimes you make choices that seem wrong to everyone else, but feel right in the moment. I was 20 years old, pregnant, and absolutely terrified. Connor was so intense about everything back then, always making these grand plans about our future when I could barely handle what was happening in the present. When I told him I was pregnant, he went into full provider mode, talking about baby names and wedding venues like we had our whole lives figured out. But I wasn't ready for any of that. I was barely an adult myself, working at this dead-end job just trying to pay my bills, and suddenly I'm supposed to be someone's wife and mother? The pressure was suffocating. That's when Luke came into the picture. He worked at the same place I did, and he actually listened when I talked about being scared. Connor would just tell me everything would be fine and we'd figure it out together. But Luke understood that sometimes you need to process your feelings before you can move forward. He didn't judge me for being overwhelmed or confused. So, yeah, things happened between us. It wasn't this calculated affair that Connor likes to paint it as. It was me trying to figure out what I wanted my life to look like. And honestly, when you're that young and that scared, you don't always make perfect decisions. The whole paternity situation was a mess, but that wasn't entirely my fault. I genuinely wasn't sure who the father was at first, and uncertainty isn't the same thing as lying. Connor acted like I had deliberately deceived him, but the timeline was complicated, and I was doing the best I could with an impossible situation. When we finally got the paternity test done, and it came back that Nikki wasn't his, Connor completely lost it. He got into this huge fight with Luke, made this massive scene, and then just disappeared from our lives like we'd never mattered to him at all. Just packed up and moved away without even trying to work things out or stay in touch. Left me to deal with a newborn and all the aftermath by myself while he went off to start fresh somewhere else. Luke stepped up for a while, I'll give him that. He helped raise Nikki for 7 years, and I thought we were building something real together. But then he found out through some family drama that he wasn't Nikki's biological father either. And suddenly, he couldn't handle it anymore. Another man who claimed to love us until things got complicated, then bailed when reality set in. So there I was, a single mother with a 7-year-old daughter and no support system. Everyone in town had opinions about our situation, about how I'd messed up and hurt those poor men. But nobody seemed to care about how I was managing to keep everything together on my own. I worked multiple jobs to keep us afloat, made sure Nikki had everything she needed, and built a life for us without depending on anyone else. Sure, kids at school said things sometimes about Nikki not having a dad around, but that's just small-town gossip, and people love to tear down single mothers. I always told Nikki that we didn't need anyone else, that we were stronger as a team. She seemed to understand that growing up, or at least I thought she did. I never badmouthed Connor or Luke to her directly, but I also wasn't going to pretend they were heroes when they both abandoned us the moment things got messy. Nikki grew up knowing that we only had each other, and I thought that made her stronger and more independent. She turned out fine, despite all the drama the men in our lives had caused. At least that's what I believed until last month when everything went completely sideways. I thought Connor was out of our lives forever, that we'd never have to deal with his judgment or his version of what happened ever again. Shows how wrong I was about that. So last month, there was this impromptu high school reunion thing happening at the community center downtown. Normally I avoid these events because they're just excuses for people to show off about their perfect marriages and successful careers, but my friend talked me into going. She said it might be fun to see how everyone turned out, and honestly, I was curious too. I look good for my age, I've got my life together, and I figured it was time to stop hiding from my past. The evening started out pretty normal, just the usual small talk and catching up with people I hadn't seen in years. Everyone was being polite and asking about Nikki, saying how proud I must be of how she turned out. Which I am, by the way. Despite everything we went through, she's smart and beautiful and independent. I was actually having a decent time until I saw him across the room. Connor. After 24 freaking years, there he was. Looking, well, he looked successful. You know that look some men get when they've made something of themselves? The expensive clothes, the confident posture, the way other people gravitate toward them? That was Connor now. He was talking to some people I didn't recognize, probably colleagues or business contacts, and he had this air of authority that he definitely didn't have when we were young. For a moment I considered just avoiding him completely, pretending I hadn't seen him, but then I figured we're both adults now. Maybe it was time to clear the air, show him that I wasn't the same confused girl he'd left behind. So I walked over and said hi, kept it light and friendly. He was polite enough, but I could tell he was being careful with every word, like he was talking to someone he didn't quite trust. I tried to make normal conversation, asked about his work, mentioned that he looked like he was doing well for himself. He answered my questions, but didn't really ask much about me in return, which felt kind of rude, honestly. Here I was, making an effort to be mature about our past, and he couldn't even pretend to be interested in how my life had turned out. I mentioned that Nikki was somewhere around the party, that she'd grown up to be an amazing young woman despite everything. Something shifted in his expression when I said her name. Not anger exactly, but something I couldn't quite read. I suggested maybe we could catch up properly sometime while he was in town, grab coffee or something, just to put the past behind us once and for all. But he gave me this polite smile and said he didn't really see the point in rehashing old history. That stung more than I expected it to. I mean, I wasn't asking to get back together or anything, just trying to be civil. But apparently, even basic courtesy was too much to ask from him. So I said fine, whatever, and went back to mingling with other people. I honestly tried to put the whole interaction out of my mind and just enjoy the rest of the evening. I was getting ready to leave around 10 when I noticed Nikki sitting at a corner table, deep in conversation with someone. When I got a better look, I realized it was Connor. They were leaning toward each other, talking intently, and something about the whole scene made me uncomfortable. What could they possibly have to discuss? He barely knew her when she was little, and now suddenly he was interested in having long conversations with her? I watched from across the room, trying to figure out what was going on. Nikki looked more animated than I'd seen her in months, gesturing with her hands and speaking with this intensity that was unusual for her. Connor was listening like whatever she was saying was the most important thing he'd ever heard. The conversation went on for at least 15 minutes, maybe longer. When they finally stood up, they exchanged phone numbers. Actually exchanged numbers, like they were planning to stay in touch. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I waited until Connor left the party, then went over to ask Nikki what that was all about. She just shrugged and said they'd been talking about old times, that he seemed like a nice guy. Nice? This was the same man who had abandoned us when things got complicated, and now suddenly he was nice? I tried to explain to her that Connor had a history of disappearing when life got messy, that she shouldn't trust him based on one conversation. But she gave me this look and said she was old enough to make her own decisions about people. That worried me more than I wanted to admit. Over the next few days, I started noticing changes in Nikki's behavior that set off every alarm bell I had. She was texting constantly, way more than usual, and she'd get this secretive look whenever I came into the room. She's always been pretty open with me about her social life, but suddenly she was taking phone calls behind closed doors and getting defensive when I asked simple questions about her day. When I asked who she was talking to so much, she'd just say, "A friend from the reunion," and change the subject. I had a sinking feeling it was Connor, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or controlling by accusing her of anything without proof. I tried bringing up the reunion casually, asking what she and Connor had talked about for so long that night. She said he was curious about how we'd been doing all these years, that he seemed genuinely interested in her life and what she'd been up to. That made me even more suspicious. Why would he suddenly care about Nikki after ignoring her existence for over 2 decades? What was his angle here? The secretive behavior continued and got worse. More hushed phone conversations, more mysterious plans that she wouldn't discuss, more defensive reactions when I tried to show normal motherly interest in what she was doing. Then she started going out more often, dressed up nicer than usual, claiming she was meeting someone from the reunion for drinks or dinner. She never said who specifically, but she'd come home with this energized mood, like she'd had some kind of breakthrough or revelation. When I'd ask how her evening went, she'd just say it was good or interesting, and disappear into her room. This went on for about 2 weeks, and I was getting more worried by the day. My daughter, who had always been my best friend and closest confidant, was becoming a stranger. She'd look at me sometimes with this expression I'd never seen before, like she was studying me or trying to figure something out. It was clear that Connor was filling her head with something, probably his version of what had happened between us all those years ago. I decided I needed to have a serious conversation with her about it before things went any further. So I sat her down one evening and tried to explain why I was concerned. I told her that Connor had hurt our family deeply when she was just a baby, that he wasn't the reliable person he might seem to be now. I explained how he'd abandoned us when we needed him most, how he'd chosen his pride over taking responsibility for the mess we were all in. But instead of understanding my concerns like I'd hoped, she got angry. Not just annoyed or defensive, but actually angry in a way I'd rarely seen from her. She said I was being controlling and manipulative, that I couldn't protect her from the truth forever. The truth? What truth was she talking about? I'd always been honest with her about our situation, about how we'd ended up on our own. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said Connor had been telling her his side of the story, and that she deserved to hear both perspectives before making any judgments. Both sides? There was only one side that mattered. The truth about what actually happened. But apparently Connor had been spending weeks painting himself as some kind of victim, making me out to be the villain who had destroyed his life for no reason. I could see that whatever Connor was telling her was working. Nikki started questioning things that had never been issues before, asking why I'd never tried to maintain contact with him after the breakup, why I'd never encouraged a relationship between them over the years. I explained that he was the one who had chosen to leave, that you can't force someone to be part of your life if they don't want to be there. But she acted like I had somehow prevented him from being involved, like I'd been keeping them apart deliberately. She wanted to know why I'd never told her his last name or where he'd moved to, why I'd been so vague about the details of our relationship. I tried to explain that I was protecting her from unnecessary pain, that there was no point in her knowing about someone who had made it clear he didn't want to be in our lives. But she saw it as me hiding things from her, controlling the narrative to make myself look better. The conversations became arguments, and the arguments became cold silences. Within a few weeks, Nikki was barely speaking to me at all. She'd come home from work, grab something to eat, and disappear into her room. When she was home, she'd look at me like I was a stranger, like she was seeing me for the first time, and didn't like what she found. It was obvious that Connor was poisoning her against me, filling her head with lies and half-truths designed to turn her into his ally. She started staying out later and later, sometimes not coming home until the next morning. When I'd ask where she'd been, she'd say she was getting answers to questions I should have asked years ago, or learning about family history that was kept from me. The dramatic way she talked made it clear that Connor was feeding her some sob story about being the wronged party in our whole situation. I was losing my patience with both of them. Here I was, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her alone, who had worked multiple jobs and given up my own dreams to make sure she had everything she needed, and she was choosing to believe some man who'd been absent her entire life over her own mother. It felt like the ultimate betrayal, and I started to wonder if this was Connor's plan all along. Maybe he'd been waiting for the perfect opportunity to get back at me, and Nikki was just his weapon of choice. The thought made me sick, but it was the only explanation that made sense. Why else would he suddenly show interest in a daughter he'd never wanted to know? Then it happened. A thing that changed everything and showed me just how far Connor was willing to go for his revenge. I was having a normal morning, getting ready for work, when I got a notification on my phone. Someone had sent me a message on Instagram. When I opened it, I saw a photo that made my entire world collapse. It was Nikki and Connor in what was obviously a hotel room, clearly in bed together, covered by sheets but unmistakably naked. They were both looking at the camera with these satisfied expressions, like they'd just accomplished something important. The caption read, "I can finally call him Daddy." I stared at that image for what felt like hours, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. My daughter. My baby girl. With Connor. The man who was supposed to marry me 24 years ago. The man who could have been her stepfather if things had worked out differently. They had. They were. I couldn't even form the thought completely. The photo was sent as a disappearing message, so it was gone after a few seconds, but the image was burned into my memory forever. This wasn't just rebellion or teenage acting out. This was calculated. This was revenge. And Connor had somehow manipulated my own daughter into being his weapon against me. The sickest part was that he'd probably convinced her it was her idea, that she was getting back at me for some imagined wrong. I called Nikki immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I called again and again, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. When she finally answered after the 10th try, I could barely get words out. I asked her where she was, what she was doing, what that photo meant, if she understood what she'd done. But she was calm, eerily calm, like she'd been expecting this call and had prepared for it. She said she was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she wanted to do. There was something different about her voice, something cold and detached that I'd never heard before. I asked her if she realized how sick and twisted this whole situation was, if she understood that Connor was using her to get back at me. But she just laughed. This bitter, hollow laugh that didn't sound like my daughter at all. She said I was the last person who should be talking about sick and twisted behavior. That's when she started attacking me with details about the past that I'd never shared with anyone. Things that only Connor could have told her. She knew about the exact timeline of when I'd been with both Connor and Luke. She knew about the confusion around the paternity test. She knew things that I'd never discussed with her, but presented in the worst possible light. According to her version, which was obviously Connor's version, I had been deliberately playing both men against each other, lying and manipulating everyone for my own selfish benefit. She said I'd destroyed Connor's chance at having a family, ruined his life, and then done the same thing to Luke. She called me selfish and manipulative, said I'd never taken responsibility for the pain I'd caused other people. I tried to explain that she wasn't getting the full story, that Connor was twisting everything to make himself look like the victim. But she cut me off and said she was done listening to my lies, that she'd finally found someone who would tell her the truth about our family's history. Then Connor got on the phone, and his voice was so calm and friendly it made my skin crawl, like we were just old friends catching up instead of whatever this sick situation actually was. He said he hoped I understood that this wasn't really about me anymore, that it was about Nikki finally learning the truth about where she came from. He said they'd been talking for weeks, that she'd been asking him questions about the past, and he'd simply been honest with her about what really happened. Honest. Like he was some kind of saint for filling my daughter's head with his twisted version of events from over 2 decades ago. I told him he was disgusting, that using my daughter to get revenge on me was the most pathetic thing I'd ever witnessed. But he just chuckled and said he wasn't using anyone, that Nikki had made her own choices once she knew the truth about her mother. He said she was old enough to decide who she wanted in her life and who she wanted to cut out of it. The implication was crystal clear. I was the one being cut out. Then Nikki got back on the phone and delivered the final blow. She told me she was leaving town, moving away to start fresh somewhere nobody knew our family's messy history. She was tired of being known as the bastard child or Ella's mistake everywhere she went. And Connor was going with her. Or rather, she was going with him to build a new life together. I begged her to think about what she was doing, to consider that Connor might not have her best interests at heart, that this was all just his way of getting back at me. But she said Connor was the only person who'd ever been completely honest with her about the past, the only one who understood what it felt like to be betrayed by someone you trusted. She said I'd had 23 years to tell her the truth about everything, and instead I'd filled her head with lies about being abandoned by men who didn't really care. Now she knew better, and she was making the choice to be with someone who valued honesty over protecting people's feelings. The conversation ended with her telling me not to contact them anymore, that she needed time and space to build a healthy relationship without the toxicity of our past hanging over everything. Then the line went dead, and I was sitting in my kitchen staring at my phone, trying to understand how my entire life had just crumbled in the span of one morning. 6 months later, and I'm still trying to figure out how everything went so completely wrong so fast. Nikki moved clear across the country with Connor, and from what I can tell through the little information I can gather, they're living together like some kind of twisted, happy couple. She blocked me on everything: phone, social media, email, everything. I have absolutely no way to contact my own daughter, no way to know if she's okay or if she's regretting her decision. It's like she just disappeared from my life completely. I hired a private investigator to try to find out where they went, what they were doing, if Nikki was safe. When I finally got an address and called the number, Connor answered like he'd been expecting my call. He told me very calmly that if I didn't stop harassing them, he would file a restraining order and make sure I could never contact Nikki again legally. Harassing them? I'm her mother. I have a right to know if my daughter is okay, don't I? But apparently, Nikki had told him that any contact from me would be unwelcome, that she considered me a toxic presence in her life that she needed protection from. My own daughter thinks I'm dangerous to her well-being. The ripple effects have been devastating in ways I never could have predicted. Nikki didn't just disappear quietly. She made sure to tell her version of events to everyone who would listen before she left. She called my sister and gave her Connor's entire sob story about what had happened 24 years ago, painting me as this manipulative woman who had destroyed multiple lives for selfish reasons. Suddenly, my own family started looking at me differently, questioning things that had never been issues before. My sister actually asked me if Connor's version was true, if I'd really been playing games with both men back then. She wanted to know if I'd been lying to everyone about what really happened, if I was really the victim I'd always claimed to be. I tried to explain that the situation had been complicated, that I was young and scared and trying to make the best decisions I could with limited options. But she just gave me this look like she didn't even know who I was anymore, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time and didn't like what she found. Work became absolutely unbearable once the story started spreading around town. You know how small communities are. Everyone knows everyone else's business, and a scandal like this was too juicy to keep quiet. The story of Connor coming back after 24 years to reclaim my daughter was apparently the most entertaining thing that had happened in years. People would stop talking when I walked into rooms, or worse, they'd give me these pitying looks like I was some tragic figure who had brought everything on herself through bad choices. Clients started requesting different representatives, colleagues avoided making eye contact, and I could feel everyone's judgment every single day. I finally had to quit my job because the atmosphere became so hostile and uncomfortable that I couldn't function there anymore. The financial stress of being unemployed just added another layer to everything else that was falling apart. But the absolute worst part is watching them live their perfect little life together. Through the social media accounts, I can still see, through fake profiles I had to create, Connor posts photos of them constantly, at nice restaurants, on weekend trips, at work events where she's his plus one. They look happy and carefree, like they're a completely normal couple instead of whatever sick relationship this actually is. And Nikki posts things too, talking about finally understanding what real honesty looks like, and surrounding herself with people who value truth over comfort. She looks genuinely happy in all the photos, which somehow makes everything even worse. Meanwhile, my life has completely fallen apart. I can't find decent work because potential employers Google my name and find articles about the scandal. I'm struggling to pay rent, applying for jobs that are way below what I'm qualified for, just trying to survive financially. I had to sell my car and move to a smaller apartment because I couldn't afford the payments anymore. Everything I'd built over the past 24 years has crumbled. And for what? Because I made some imperfect choices when I was barely an adult? The few people who still talk to me keep suggesting that maybe I should do some self-reflection and consider that Connor and Nikki might have valid points about my past behavior. They think I should apologize, should try to make amends for what I supposedly did wrong all those years ago. They act like this is all some kind of learning experience that will make me a better person in the end. But I'm not apologizing for anything. I was 20 years old, pregnant, and terrified about my future. I made the best decisions I could with the information and options I had at the time. Connor abandoned us when things got complicated, Luke abandoned us when things got complicated, and I was the one who stayed and raised Nikki for 23 years. I sacrificed my own dreams and opportunities to make sure she had everything she needed. If that's not enough for her, if she'd rather believe his manipulative sob story and destroy our family over something that happened before she was even born, then that's her choice to make. I'm done trying to fix relationships with people who don't appreciate what I've given up for them. I'm done explaining myself to people who have already decided I'm the villain in this story. Connor got exactly what he wanted. He destroyed my relationship with my daughter, ruined my reputation in this town, and walked away looking like some kind of hero who finally got justice. And Nikki gets to play the victim who finally escaped her toxic mother and found someone who really understands her. Everyone wins, except me, the woman who actually did the hard work of raising a child alone for over 2 decades. But that's fine. They can have their twisted little fairy tale. I know what really happened. And I know what kind of person I actually am, regardless of what anyone else chooses to believe.